Welcome to Baruch College, welcome to the School of Public Affairs, and welcome to the Spring Ackerman Lecture. This series honors Rosalind Engelman's parents, Lily and Nathan Ackerman. What they have done is to give this college and to give this school, to give the students in all of our classes and the faculty members who care about issues of social justice, which is essentially all of us, an opportunity 2 times a year to sit down with some of the best thinkers in the country about these issues and explore from their perspective. And of course, everybody's nurturing a slightly different corner of this very wide territory, what we should be thinking about now, how that should influence the way that young people understand their responsibilities as they study how to formulate, implement, and evaluate policies. And what research areas are most fertile for those of us who are in the business of producing the scholarship in this arena to shape and to inform our own work. This is vital, vital work, and we are enormously grateful to the Engelmans over the period of years that they have funded this program for the terrific contribution that this has made to this event and the intellectual life at this college. I would now like to bring to the podium Marian Engelman-Lotto, who was a member of this faculty, who has a degree in law, who has a distinguished and lengthy career in public law, first with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and now with Earth Justice after a stint in between. She's one of those academic recidivists and went back and became a professor again, but she saw the light and she's back suing people today, now in the cause of environmental justice. And she is one of the most articulate voices for the ways in which what we study in the academy walks across through courtrooms and non-legal solutions to justice issues. Marian Engelman-Lotto.
Last week, in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day and in the spirit of Holocaust Remembrance Day, I and a number of people in this room attended a reading of a Harold Pinter play in New York on 42nd Street. This post-World War II play called Ashes to Ashes dealt with memory, relationships, responsibility, and themes of inequality and oppression. At the conclusion of the play, the actors stayed on stage to answer questions, and my mother, a painter whose work deals with man's inhumanity to man, joined the actors on the stage, and they actually brought up some of her sculptures and her painting. And it was inspiring to me to see how the whole room really truly wrestled with this very abstract play. It's very hard to understand concepts and the ideas of personal and institutional oppression. Every generation stands on the shoulders of those who come before. And I'm proud that my parents, thankful for all that Nathan and Lily Ackerman, our immigrant grandparents, did for them, acknowledged their effort through this lectureship. My sister and I benefited from the values and support handed to us from our parents as well. This lectureship is one way in which we honor those who came before and the hardship that they faced, lest we forget. At the same time, we must also remember the at times harmful and painful legacy of history left to us by previous generations, and the way in which this history remains a driver for our situation today. Indeed, perhaps remains a driver for our behavior, sometimes unconscious, but our behavior today. We can't ignore history. And for this reason, we gathered this past week to discuss the Holocaust. For this reason, we recognize the specific legacy of racial discrimination and structural inequality in the United States. And it seems appropriate for this lecture series on this particular week to engage us on whether we are or ever can be beyond race. I look forward to this evening as we wrestle with these issues. Thank you.
I don't get the honor of introducing Lawrence Bobo. That pleasure goes to Ryan Smith, who is the current occupant of the Ackerman Chair. He is a sociologist with an interest particularly in ladders of success in institutional America. He has done path-breaking work to try to understand what the levers of success are, how that is influenced by personal capacity, by racial and gender discrimination, by the networks that people form as a buttress against racial and gender discrimination, and has a terrific body of work.
Lawrence D. Bobo is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University. He holds appointments in the Department of Sociology and the Department of African and African American Studies there. His research focuses on the intersection of social inequality, politics, and race. He is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Alphonse M. Fletcher Senior Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and also a Russell Sage Foundation visiting scholar as well. He has had tenured appointments at the University of Wisconsin, UCLA, Stanford University, and while at Stanford, he was in fact the director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. In terms of his research, it has appeared in dozens of peer-reviewed journals. He is the founding editor of the Du Bois Review, a social science research on race, which is published by Cambridge University Press. And he is co-author of the award-winning book on racial attitudes in America, Trends and Interpretations. He's the senior editor of Prismatic Metropolis, Inequality in Los Angeles, published by Russell Sage Foundation. And his most recent book is titled Prejudice in Politics, Group Position, Public Opinion, and the Wisconsin Treaty Rights Dispute. That book was a finalist for the 2007 C. Wright Mills Award. Most recently, Dr. Bobo was named the 2012 recipient of the Cooley-Mead Award. The Cooley-Mead Award is given annually to an individual who has made lifetime contributions to distinguished scholarship in the area of sociological social psychology. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome my mentor and my friend for the last 25 years, Dr. Lawrence Douglas Bobo.
I'm greatly honored to be able to deliver the Lillian and Nathan Ackerman lecture this evening. My remarks will indeed broadly engage the topic of post-racial dreams, American realities. Does the color line endure? The talk draws from several chapters of a book I'm currently trying to write. I'm on sabbatical and I'm supposed to be nearly finished now, and I see the time winding down, and it's not quite there yet, but you can all help me out. The book wrestles with what I perceive, or rather worry, is the new American folk wisdom. Namely, that the U.S. is effectively, or close enough, to being post-racial, that we are substantially beyond the point of having to worry about and work on healing a long history of racial division. That to some, we now stand at the precipice of a bold, race-neutral social order and reality. My interpretation of this new folk wisdom of post-racialism leads me to conclude, my friends, that we ain't there yet. Unlike many sociological analysts, however, I don't want to offer a simple kind of headlined, obsessed tale and unflinching narrative of the power of enduring racism. My ambition, rather, is to sketch what I hope ends up being a more nuanced analysis, one that deals with both the good and the bad, the positive and the negative of an evolving color line in America. Now, my short answer is that the new folk wisdom of post-racialism is a narrative that has far overreached the actual features of how much progress we've made and where we stand today, so that in effect, we're not yet beyond race. In aiming to convince you that the triumphalism of the post-racial narrative is premature, I want to consider kind of five main lines of argument. First, I kind of have to begin with thinking about some different ways of conceiving of the very term post-racial, how it gets invoked, what people attempt to mean by it. After that, I want to consider the election of Barack Obama as 44th President of the United States and first African-American president, arguably the watershed event solidifying the post-racial narrative. After that, I want to consider whether we are witnessing the, in effect, end of blackness as a social category and identity in the U.S. Then I will address the implications of a large and successful black middle-class population. Then I consider, but more briefly, how processes of what sociologists would term racialization may well reach beyond the traditional black-white divide to be having an effect on the experiences of the heterogeneous Latina population and those of Asian background as well. And then very lastly, at the end, I'll speculate a bit about whether we are witnessing the emergence of what some call a new racial divide. So that's the terrain. There obviously are a whole host of issues that one could have brought to this sort of lecture. It could be a talk about poverty and unemployment rates. It could be a talk about the achievement gap. We could deal with mass incarceration, or what legal scholar Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, and issues like the stop and frisk practices here in New York and in other cities. We could deal with the segregation of schools, voting hindrances, new ID laws, or even tragic events like the recent shooting of Trayvon Martin. All of those obviously have bearing on a full answer to this question. I'm going to deal with a much more selected set of issues, as I indicated just a moment ago. So let's turn first to some more explicit thinking about what should we mean by post-racialism, and how does that term get invoked these days? Well, it seemed to me that some uses of the term are uncontroversial, if not actually quite positive. In its simplest and least controversial form, I think the term is intended merely to signal a hopeful trajectory for events and social trends, not a declaration about accomplished facts of social life. That, in fact, what post-racialism really is an aspiration for us. It's something toward which we as a nation still strive and remain guardedly hopeful about fully achieving. And in this sense, I have no problem with the term. I would couple it, though, to a demand, perhaps. And that demand is that we be explicit about what it would really mean to be sociologically post-racial. And I hope that kind of phrase isn't a deadening one, but if we could really decouple a connection between race and where you lived, the quality of schooling your children were likely to achieve, and your likely health characteristics and outcomes, we would be closer to being sociologically post-racial. If we could break a connection between race and where you worked, what you earned, whether or not you actually had a job at all, your risk of exposure to poverty and the like, then we would be much closer to being sociologically post-racial. And if we could establish that we lived in a world where race was totally decoupled from how your fellow citizens greeted you in terms of expectations and the levels of esteem and respect you were accorded, then we would be much closer to being sociologically post-racial. Those criteria, I think, to me, are things we should continue to aspire to, and I think we have to just kind of acknowledge as not yet being the state of affairs in which we all live. Now, there are three other flavors of varieties of post-racialism that I think are a bit more problematic, or what I call debatable faces of post-racialism. One version of it is the end of the black victimology narrative. Sometimes I call this the John McWhorter posture in his book, Losing the Race. From this perspective, black complaints and grievances about inequality and discrimination are at best well-worn tales. They're passé now, if not in fact pointedly false assessments of the main challenges facing blacks in a world largely free of the dismal burdens of overt racial divisions and oppression. And I'm going to give a couple more examples of this down the road. A second variety I call the blurring the boundaries flavor, or it's the beigeification of America hypothesis. It argues that the level and pace of change in the fundamental demographic makeup of the nation and the identity choices and politics of Americans are rendering the traditional black-white divide irrelevant. Accordingly, Americans increasingly revere mixture and hybridity and are rushing to embrace a decidedly beige view of themselves and what is good for the body politic. We're all becoming at least somewhat brown. Right? And that's the story there. And it was, in fact, a cover of an Atlantic Monthly magazine not long ago and a Newsweek magazine or so, a decade or so ago. Sort of a third version, and the strongest and I argue most controversial of the three, is kind of the declaration that we're truly beyond race. To wit, American society, or at least a large and steadily growing fraction of it, has genuinely moved beyond race and racial considerations. So much so that we as a nation are now ready to transcend the disabling racial divisions of the past. This point of view and a lot of the scholarship and social reality out there has a real emotional edge to it. I'll return to further into the talk. And indeed, in many cases, kind of an anger about it in response to people who are described or depicted as playing the race card, which is regarding it as an offensive thing to do. Now, having laid out this little bit of conceptual terrain of how to think about that term post-racialism, I want to take on, head on, the biggest event in the case for post-racialism, the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States. As you know, there was a great crescendo of celebration, rightfully so, when Obama was elected, and read in many quarters as basically having proven that we are finally truly beyond race, that Obama at a minimum transcended the racial divide. What I'm arguing in this book and other places is that what Obama has really done is in fact engaged in the deft management of the existing racial divide, right? Which is different from transcending or proving that we're beyond race. And that deft management calls for him to routinely do three things. First and foremost, he is to rise above the traditional negative stereotypes of African Americans, consistently and in point of fact at virtually at all times. I just want you to imagine a world in which Barack Obama sounded like Sarah Palin. No. Secondly, he had to avoid what I call the third rail of American race politics, which later on I'm going to characterize as racial resentment. You touch that third rail of American race politics, you will get electrocuted. And in fact, it doesn't matter what your race is. A white or black politician touched it, you're fried. And Obama got close to it twice and learned a big lesson. The first time he couldn't really control. That was the controversy around Reverend Jeremiah Wright, which precipitated his race speech, a very important set of ideas and declarations. The second time, most of you may know, what was the second time he touched the third rail? Skip Gates, my buddy and chair, Henry Louis Gates. And we're going to come to that a more focused way down the road. But out of that event, quite frankly, we get the single most intensively media-covered event since the landing on the moon. Think about that. 3 men drinking beer in the Rose Garden. Headline news world over. Every country on the planet covered this event. That's how big this third rail is, okay? You got to be real careful around it. And then thirdly, Obama has to rise above those stereotypes, avoid the third rail, while simultaneously mobilizing black and other voters of color and keeping progressive whites in the coalition. That's a complicated act, my friends. But that's what I mean by deft management of the racial divide. Now, immediately prior to Obama's election, of course, we had tons of headlines coming out in many settings. A major scholarly essay entitled The End of the Black American Narrative by scholar Charles Johnson appears in June of '08. The New York Times Magazine runs a front page cover by Matt Bai, Obama and the End of Black Politics. David Remnick of The New Yorker starts writing about the Joshua generation race in the Obama campaign, essentially suggesting that especially younger people were there. They were ready to cross over to the other side of the River Jordan, right? All you other people are on this shore thinking about race, we are done. We're moving in the other direction. John Tierney of the New York Times, on the day before the election, in strong anticipation that Obama was going to win, writes a piece called "Where Have All the Bigots Gone?" In particular, you social scientists who study implicit attitudes and claim we're all biased and negative, this country's about to elect a black president. You're wrong. And then the Atlantic Monthly, the Beigeification argument, the end of white America, they declared in January 2009. And there have since been a flood of books. Eugene Robbins' Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America, Ellis Cose's The End of Anger, A New Generation's Take on Race and Rap, and Touré's Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness. In order to drive home the message I want to make here, sometimes academics, simple prose, scholarly analysis aren't the answer. I want us to go back to a television program that took place months before Barack Obama officially announced his candidacy. And where else to go but to Stephen Colbert and the Colbert Report.
Of course, we've already had announcements from big names like Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, Mitt Romney, and Senator Joseph Biden, who, if I'm not mistaken, withdrew from the race the same day. But of course, the announcement everyone's waiting for is Barack Obama's. Now, Senator Obama is not the first African American to run for president, but he's the first African American to have a prayer, which is ironic since two of the others were reverends. Obama will announce his candidacy this weekend at the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln made his stirring House Divided speech. How historic. At a building made famous by the man who freed the slaves, now begins the presidential campaign of a man who is the descendant of slaves. Of course, the buzzkillers out there want to drain the significance of this event just because Obama isn't the descendant of slaves. His father emigrated from Kenya in 1959, and his mom is the Swiss Miss Girl. Some are even claiming that the senator has not lived the, quote, black experience, and it may affect his support in the African-American community. Here to explain is columnist for Salon.com and author of the book, The End of Blackness, Deborah Dickerson. Ms. Dickerson, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your book is the End of Blackness, and I want to come out right here and say I'm against ending blackness. I believe that everyone has a right to be black. It's a choice, and I support that. Now, settle something for me, okay?
Yes.
Is Barack Obama black?
No, he's not. In the American political context, black means the son of West African, the descendant of West African slaves brought here to labor in the United States. It's not a put down. It's not to say that he hasn't suffered. It's not to say that he doesn't have a glorious lineage of his own. It's just to say that he and I, who am descended from West African slaves brought to America, we are not the same.
Okay, so if he's not black, why doesn't he just run as a white guy? Because we know black people will vote for white people, and white people will vote for white people, but we're not sure white people will vote for black people.
Right.
So it seems like by self-identifying as a black man, because he says that he's a black guy, he says nobody thought a black guy born in Hawaii with a father from Kenya and a mother from Kansas could actually win a race. So why didn't you just say, you know, I'm a white guy? I mean, then it's a lock.
Right. Well, he's not white either. He is an African American, or he is an
Should we
American.
think of a new name for what he is?
We do. We need a new name because
what about
there's
nouveau black? You know, late to the scene blackness.
Well, we could go with as black as circumstances allow, but
that's not bad. I like that. Well, I gotta say, Ms. Dickerson, I am disappointed in this because, you know, I was really looking forward to voting for a black guy. I mean, I was really hoping to leave the voting booth and say, hey, I voted for a black guy.
you can say I voted for an American of an African American, an American of African immigrant stock, and he's also a person who has adopted the role of being black. So he's not he's a brother, but he's an adopted brother. And the significance of this, he's a beloved adopted brother. The significance
So he's like a
this,
redheaded stepchild. You can slap him around a little bit and nobody's gonna care.
Well, we love him just the same.
Okay, all right, but shouldn't black people jump on the Obama wagon? Because if he doesn't have the burden of this past of being the descendant of African slaves, he doesn't feel the black experience, can't he just sort of carry the torch and y'all just piggyback on him?
Well, I think that's what's going to happen. I think Barack Obama is a wonderful person. We're proud of him. And this is not a critique of him. What this is a critique of white self-congratulation, of saying we're embracing a black person when we're not really. It's a way of, if he were a sub-Saharan African, he would not get this love.
If you hadn't told me he wasn't black, I would have thought that I was supporting a black person. And then I would have been supporting all black people. But now I won't because he's not. Right.
Well, then that would make you a racist.
If I were white. But I don't necessarily know. I don't see race, okay, because I've moved beyond that. I've developed beyond that. I'm so not a racist. I don't see race. People tell me I'm white, and I believe them because I think Barack Obama is black. So
He's an African
he's an African American. So it sounds to me like you are judging blackness not on the color of someone's skin, but on the content of their character, which I think realizes Dr. King's dream in a very special way.
I think you mean not so much special as perverted, but I think that you got me so confused here. No, it's not the content of our character, it's the content of our history and our culture. And what we're doing by calling him black is obliterating the culture of his Kenyan father.
Well, would this make it more acceptable to the African American community if he shared some of the experience, the Black American experience, and he wasn't a descendant of slaves, but what if for just a brief period of time he were enslaved? And then, but nothing racist. He could be like, he could be Jesse Jackson's slave or Al Sharpton's slave. And then they could say, like, okay, you're free now, and, no foul, no harm, and he's got all the street cred he needs. Think about it. Think about it.
I think you may have me there, actually.
Thank you so much for stopping by. Deborah Dickerson.
Yeah, that is just utterly priceless, I tell you. But it's one of those things that really captures the unavoidable and deep-rooted quality of race in the American cultural landscape, and I like to do that because there are few other things that drive it home in the same fashion. And I do want to say briefly, and I'll race through this part of the talk, so to speak, that in the socio-political context in which Obama was operating, the happy part of the story is that we have in the U.S. witnessed a steady and pretty much unabated repudiation of the old Jim Crow racial ideology, a racial ideology that was openly and massively embraced for a good chunk of the 20th century in this country. We, in fact, in specific, have observed high and increasing willingness in national surveys and polls of people saying they'd be ready to vote for a black presidential candidate, which was, in fact, borne out by Obama's electoral success. Nonetheless, as I've argued in other places, I think we've seen the crystallization of a sort of newer, less absolute form of racism that I call laissez-faire racism that kind of reconciles a non-discriminatory state apparatus with a free market still beset by racial inequality, negative stereotypes, the deep-rooted widespread conviction that therefore African Americans are responsible for their own fate, and that as a consequence, any intervention by government on behalf of expressly reducing inequality is deeply resented, something I will turn to a little later. These is a quick representation of the poll data to standard questions about willingness to vote for a black candidate for president if nominated by your own party. When first asked in 1958, fully 68% of white Americans said no, they would not do so even if nominated by their own party. That percentage marches steadily downward until by the time Jesse Jackson first runs in 1984, barely 1 in 5 white Americans says no, they wouldn't do it. And then by the time Obama runs in 2008, it's down well below 10%. That is nearly 90% saying they would absolutely consider voting for a black candidate for president. That's the positive side of the story. There's plenty of evidence of evolving, but by and large enduring, negative racial stereotypes of African Americans. In 1990, we asked a set of questions in our social science survey, the General Social Survey, and these are the results for our white respondents for just 2 of the traits, whether whites are rated as being more hardworking than blacks or more intelligent than blacks. And in 1990, you see roughly 68% rate whites as more hardworking, and 59% rate whites as more intelligent. They trend downward slightly, but not greatly so. And if we had asked about a whole battery of traits, about reliability, responsibility, commitment to the family, involvement with violence, involvement in gangs and drugs, and so on, you could easily paint a portrait of a whole host of pretty broadly accepted negative stereotypes. So we know that that's still alive out there. The next slide is one indicator political scientists, social psychologists, sociologists use to tap this racial resentment, the third rail I was talking about. It's a strong agreement with the Declaration, for example, and this is just one of many. Irish, Italians, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without special favors. Now, this special favors question, on its surface, reads as kind of innocuous. And you'll see that roughly 80% of white Americans, and a pretty high, roughly 50% of black Americans have endorsed this for nearly a 20-year span of time here. It means very different things for our black and white respondents. Of course, the question is targeted on blacks, so blacks understand themselves as implicated in the category that the question is about. African Americans are far more likely to generally see discrimination as a problem, far more likely when they answer this question to talk about specific individuals who they know who could behave better. My brother Jim is lazy as anything and he needs to get his stuff together. The state doesn't need to take care of him. Shanae need to stop having them babies or take care of them. You know, it's that kind of colloquial talk in the barbershop and salons. That's what it means to the African Americans. For the white respondents, it takes on a much stronger edge, and I want to give you some of the actual flavor when we ask people, now that you've said you agree with this item, why is it you feel that way? And this is from a web-based social survey. So people see the question on a screen, check off strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and go on. And then we just open the screen and write down whatever you want. Now, I want to tell you, 60% of people write more than 25 words. So this is interesting for a survey researcher. People are ready to pull the trigger on this one. They got an idea about it. Here's one answer. This guy wrote nearly 1,000 words. I am honestly tired of hearing about black discrimination. It is over with, done with. The blacks are the ones who want to keep it alive because they want everything free and don't want to work for anything. Too many of them are trying to make money off their ancestors, slaves. There are just as many other races who worked the fields and were mistreated. I'm tired of hearing about it. I think they should get over it or leave and go back to their own country. My mother's Caucasian. Her mother died at 9, and she had to work in the fields until she was 16. She didn't get any restitution. I'm tired of freeloaders in society who want everything given to them and don't want to work for anything. If they don't like it here, they should go back to their countries of origin and leave us alone. And people who forget that it was black people who sold their own people into slavery, not whites. I'm tired of hearing about this crap. Minorities have more opportunities than anyone else these days. And listen how he does this. Even illegals. Enough is enough. This shows you how that Arizona environment is running together lots of different groups and experiences. An older gentleman in Texas, most of them don't want to work for a full day's pay when they get food stamps and all the other goodies for nothing. Why work, they say? We're going to get a house and food, and you white people are going to pay for it. We deserve it. Somewhat older person in Utah. Blacks are the least discriminated against of all races in the U.S., but threaten everyone with the racial issue. Most of them expect socialistic programs to take care of them. Most do not take advantage of public education system in the U.S. Most do not work to better themselves and would rather have the government programs take care of them. Perfect setting for Obama programs. So in part, if you want a sampling of why passage of the health care legislation crystallized resentment on the right, this is about as perfect an articulation of it as you could have found. I want to do one depressing thing for a moment here, and that's remind us all of just how thoroughly racialized the first 3 years of the Obama presidency have been, and I'm going to do a small, trivial sampling. Some of you may recall early on when the Obamas were going to host the first Easter egg hunt on the White House lawn, conservative mayor out in California produced this watermelon patch postcard back in February of 2009. This anti-health care legislation ad shows Obama in loincloth with a bone through his nose, Obamacare coming to a clinic near you. Or this imagery here, which I just never get over, how a man who is the ultimate cosmopolite, the epitome of tolerance, sophistication, enlightenment, and mutual regard and recognition, depicted in Hitler mustache. I just cannot engage the racial imaginary that produced this image. Or more recently even, this picture produced by a Republican organizer out in California who was trying to explain why Obama doesn't have a birth certificate. Well, these are his parents, was this person's. That's all very heavy and troubling. We definitely need some humor to live in this. There are tons of comics who've engaged this issue of what the first African-American president might have to deal with. Here's a Dave Chappelle clip long before Obama actually ran.
I think it could be a black president one day, but you don't want to be the first one. I mean, second or third, that's fine, but that first nigga better watch out. I'm going to tell you that right now. Too hot. I mean, I'd be the first black president. I don't think that nobody would really hurt me. I'm sure somebody would want to hurt me, but I don't think they'd touch me because my vice president will be Mexican for a little insurance. You know what I'm saying? Well, you can shoot me if you want, but you're just going to open the border up, so you might as well leave me and Vice President Santiago to our own devices. Ain't that right, Santiago? See.
I want to quickly turn to this issue of the breaking down of a black social category and identity here. And I'll start with the issue of mixed or interracial marriage, which has been in the headline a fair bit lately. But I want to step back first to systematic social research dating from the 1990s, when there was little doubt that there was still not a huge amount of interracial marriage going on. One key feature, as one social scientist argued, of the data is overwhelming endogamy, in-group marriage for blacks and whites. At least 92% of white men, white women, black women, and black men are married to members of their own group, circa 1990. Now, we know a lot of change and has gone on since that period. And so I want to present some data showing change from 1990 to 2000. And the sort of highlighted boxes, which may not be highlighted all that well on this particular screen, show that between 90 and 2000, the percentage of men who were intermarried among African Americans went from 8 to 14%, among women from 4 to 5%. So there's movement, there's change going on, but it's still in any absolute sense at very low absolute levels. You may have seen a more recent report from the Pew Center on a record rise in the rate of racial intermarriage. Of all marriages in the U.S., if you could add them all up and get a percentage, what percentage are mixed race of some sort now? It's rocketed all the way up to 8%. And if you were to ask if marriages in the past, I think the period they used was 5 years, but maybe it was 2, what percentage of very recent marriages are mixed race people? It balloons up to, and remember, these were bold headlines, 15%, right? So we're still talking very low absolute levels of this mixture that's going on out there in the population. And so again, my point is, the post-racial narrative, the weight of the story being told, somehow far exceeds where things actually are on the ground level. Nonetheless, we know there are many people who live, experience, and want to be able to positively embrace a mixed racial identity. And beginning with the 2000 census, of course, the government officially made it more possible for individuals to do that by allowing you to check off more than one box on the census form. And at the time of those 2000 census results being released, the New York Times ran the following story: for 7 million people in the census, one race category is not enough. So what does that mean in terms of the number of people who end up checking just one box? That's a scary pie, because not even quite 2% checked off more than one box in that 2000 census. 98% checked off just one box. And in point of fact, if you were to take a real close focus on that 1.9%, the minority of them involved any mixture with black, right? Scarcely a third involved some degree of black mixture in that mixed racial category, which says something about just how high that wall between black and white was, despite 300 plus years of shared social space. Let's race ahead to 2010, when we know there's been all this churning, bubbling, percolating going on, especially among young people who live in a far more tolerant, different world than preceding generations. The New York Times tells us again, more young Americans choose all of the above as some part of their identity. Are you ready? It rockets all the way up to 2.3%. Again, the narrative is light years ahead of the on-the-ground reality. The percentage involving some mixture with black is up to 41%, still a minority, but growing. But again, my point is, if you were to just look at headlines, you would think blackness were on its way to disappearance. And I don't want to say nothing could be further from the truth, but it doesn't accord with a careful look at the data. The next point I want to make is that the one-drop rule, hypodescent, the kind of cultural standard that any drop of black blood essentially made one black, still remains alive. And there are two sets of experimental studies, but in order of time, I'm just using quotes from them. I'm not going to bother to do it. They find that the one-drop rule is still very powerful. I'd like to stop at this point and ask how many of you have heard the name Susie Gullery Phipps? That's good that only one or two people have heard her. She was a woman, 43 years old, circa 1977, who wanted to apply for a passport, so she wrote off to get a copy of her birth certificate. She didn't actually have a copy of her birth certificate. She gets her birth certificate and sees that she is designated as colored, as were both of her parents, even though she'd been living as a white woman her whole life. She's outraged and goes to the birth records office there and says, this can't be right. The clerk checks her and says, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, this is all in accord with the records as we understand them. She brings a lawsuit to get her race changed because she's certain she's white. They dig through the files, and she actually loses through 2 rounds of appeals. She's really litigious about being declared white. And at the end of the day, the old Louisiana Constitution read that it could be established that you were even 1/32nd black, you were officially black under the Louisiana State Constitution. And so she had a great-great-grandmother who was a freed slave. Period. End of story. Louisiana State Supreme Court said, sorry, you are black. Fortunately for her, black folks are pretty forgiving, and will take her in despite all that struggling to leave us behind. But that's the point of how we created this one-drop rule, so that state constitutions contain this incredible language, some even more extreme than that literally said any drop of African ancestry, not specific to as remote as 1/32nd, made you black, creating a very powerful cultural standard. In fact, I like to point out to people, because Americans are such present-oriented folks, the 1900 census contained categories not merely for black and white, but for mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, which were still there in 1910, and several million people in 1900 were in this category. So mixture ain't a new thing. Allowing official recognition of it after the Jim Crow era is what's new, because Jim Crow narrowed the world down to 2 categories, basically, black or white, regardless of the actual lived complexity out there in the world. A point to bear in mind toward the end. I want to talk about the growth of a black middle class. And I don't want to do a whole lot about it except to complicate the idea that this is now a group of unfettered social mobility and movement, effectively unconstrained by race. And why don't we think for a little bit about the Beer Summit?
Your home is safe. But is it safe from black intellectuals?
Hello.
This is Gates Home Security.
You all right? Someone tried to break in.
Was it Harvard Professor Henry Louis Gates?
I'm not sure. He had tenure. It could have been Cornell West.
Stay where you are. We're sending help.
Henry Louis Gates can strike
There
at
we
any
go.
time. Make sure your family is safe. Gates Home Security also protects against Tavis Smiley, Maya Angelou, Harry Belafonte, Ashton Kutcher, Alice Walker, Michael Eric Dyson, Alex Haley, Seal, Jackie Robinson, Sojourner Truth, and Danny Glover. Gates Home Security. When black intellectuals strike, we take affirmative action.
The Bill Maher Show created this on July 9th. Gates was, of course, arrested on July 8th. The news of it breaks, I think, July 8th. They ran this the next night to show you just how creative some people were on this. But the point is that an internationally famous man of very high-class status, walking into his own home, can, in fact, be arrested and charged with disorderly conduct in the United States of America. It's a fascinating case, complicated case in some respects. But it drives home the point that black middle-class status is not without its complexities. The principal complexity I want to focus on here regards the enormous disparities in asset or wealth holding that separate black and white America, even among those of otherwise pretty comparably high professional or educational backgrounds. These are figures produced by Tom Shapiro and his group at Brandeis University on the widening wealth gap. which they say the median wealth assets in black households and white households were separated by about $20,000 in 1984. During that ensuing boom period in the stock market, it widened more than tripling, or quadrupling, in fact, in that time period to some $95,000. And in fact, I think the somewhat more recent Pew Center numbers identify the gap as even larger. And in a world in which more of us are going to have to undergo job changes, in a world in which more of us will have periods of unemployment, in a world in which more of us will be trying to send children to very expensive schools or paying for expensive health care or helping out retired parents, not having wealth is going to prove to be a much bigger liability than it was in the past. Okay? This is a huge matter where the gap is actually growing worse, not smaller. Now, I don't want to say that the wealth problem in America is all driven by the race issue, because it's not, because it's pretty clear that it's really the 1% who did really, really well, that blue line here, that even middle-income whites have lost ground relative to the very wealthy, but that even the highest income segment of the black community is at the bottom of this chart and losing ground in most recent years. And that's the kind of point that I want to draw home, again, about not exaggerating what the existence of a substantial African-American middle class means, especially going forward, in a context in which the housing crisis hit African Americans, and Latinos for that matter, harder than the average in effect, and in which African Americans have been very slow to regain ground as the recovery has been underway. Kind of the last thing to talk about here is racialization and the tale of assimilation seemingly working for groups other than those understood as black. Is that really the case? As we all know, there's great anxiety afoot in the land because of this figure, in effect, which shows population trends changing, predicting, and I'm sorry the very bottom row didn't come through, that around roughly 2040, 2042, America should no longer be majority white. That through a combination of Hispanic, Black, Asian, and other groups, that whites will fall below majority status. And this is one of the great anxieties fueling something like the Tea Party movement. Well, it leads us to pose the question if the assumptions behind this kind of figure are true. Some strong versions of the assimilation argument suggest that at least, for example, many Asian American groups, these barriers are breaking down quickly, right? High rates of intermarriage and so on. This table's a little hard to read, but the parts that are circled in boxes there are what I really want you to see. The top two figures that show for 2000 the percentage of Asian men and Asian women married to non-Asians, that is, who really in effect crossed a racial line. Much higher than for blacks, but not that high, actually. 12% for men and 23% for women. That to the extent there's mixture going on, it's within the broad Asian category. Chinese marrying Vietnamese, marrying Korean, marrying Cambodian, Thai, so on, but not necessarily crossing racial lines. Again, the narrative moving well ahead, I think, of the on-the-ground, substantial lived reality. You could tell an even stronger story about Latinos, particularly at least for the Mexican-American population, the single largest group of Latin American origin. And I'm going to read a quote from my colleague and friend and distinguished sociologist, Doug Massey, who suggests that U.S. policies are moving Mexican Americans steadily away from their middle position in the economic hierarchy and toward the formation of a racialized underclass. This is a very strong declaration, actually. Segregation levels are rising, discrimination is increasing, poverty is deepening, education levels are stagnating, and the social safety net has been deliberately poked full of holes to allow immigrants to fall through. Whether or not Mexicans become a new urban underclass remains to be seen. But it is already clear that after occupying a middle socioeconomic position between blacks and whites for generations, the economic fortunes of Mexicans have now fallen to levels at or below those of African Americans. Indeed, a fairly recent, and I would argue definitive book by my former UCLA colleagues Eddie Tejas and Vilma Ortiz called Generations of Exclusion establishes that third and fourth generation Mexican Americans actually end up falling behind the second generation. They flat out in education and get no greater occupational gains. So the story of assimilation, upward out, moving forward, it is just not happening in this case. And we shouldn't be operating under the assumption that we are in the midst of this nice, happy replication of the assimilation tale. Does all this mean that we're working toward a new set of racial divides? Some scholars argue, in fact, that we're creating a new big division between those who are going to be put in a black subordinated category and some degrees of non-blackness to whiteness on the other. Herbert Gans, distinguished sociologist at Columbia, great urban ethnographer and theorist and researcher, suggested if current trends persist, today's multiracial hierarchy could be replaced by what I think of as a dual or bimodal one, consisting of non-black and black population categories, with a third residual category for groups that do not or do not yet fit into the basic dualism. Now, he didn't go into this as a demographer. He didn't go into this as someone looking carefully at population data. We have more recently seen Frank Bean, who is a demographer, and his colleagues produce a very powerful book arguing that Gans was disturbingly close to being right on the money in terms of looking across a lot of different indicators of educational attainment, residential mobility and placement, marriage patterns, and the like. In a 2009 national survey, I asked a sample of folks whether they thought we have already achieved racial equality, will soon get there, will get there in their lifetimes maybe, or will never achieve racial equality. And you see at this point, 61% of white Americans said we've already achieved racial equality. That's a big jump up from the numbers from 2005, the previous time I asked this question. So that Obama's election really did contribute to a great bump in the perception that we've arrived at the post-racial moment. It increases for African Americans as well, but only 17% say we're already there, and the rest, or near majority, are split almost 50-50 as to whether we'll get there, and fully more than 1 in 10 blacks say we're never going to get to racial equality. One real interesting question is what young people think, and Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago has done important surveys of black youth, Latino youth, and white youth. And she found, for example, even following Obama's election, that 68% of black youth said racism remains a major problem. 58% of the Latino youth said so, as contrasted to 33% of white youth. So even that segment of the population where the post-racial narrative makes the strongest assumptions about readiness to let go of race, they still haven't bought the story that the problems have disappeared or gone away. I don't have time to work through a hard program of how we might do better or make enormous progress. And in fact, as I told you at the beginning, there are a whole range of domains of life I'm not even going to address: schools, the economy, our prison system, and the like. But these comments toward healing the wounds bear on that. The pitch of this talk today, in part, is that what we really need is honest and a progressively centered discourse. One that's willing to take a hard, careful look at where we actually stand, not just put forward an aspiration as though it were an already achieved reality and lived experience. The kind of policy changes that need to take place critically: a whole different level of investment in public education with supportive wraparound services, especially for those in the most economically disadvantaged communities. It's clear that we still are going to need vigorous enforcement of anti-discrimination legislation in regard to housing as well as jobs. Some thinking about wealth accumulation strategies and wealth building needs to take place. The racialized mass incarceration, or the new Jim Crow, is a problem of just incredible proportion and difficulty. And we need real immigration reform. And I will say quickly, during the 80s, we did two very contradictory things. On the one hand, we decided that North America was going to be a great free trade zone, right? That capital goods and money were going to be able to flow more freely than ever from Mexico to the U.S., U.S. to Mexico, and onward to Canada. That we did NAFTA and GATT, right? At the same time that we said capital and goods should flow more freely, we tightened up the border so that labor and people had a much harder time moving to follow capital and job flows and all of that kind of thing. Insane. We did that at the same time that we kept the same new immigration quotas that we have. And I want to push the point, because I'm deeply sympathetic with Haiti. We all want to rebuild Haiti and see it get back on its feet. But Haiti, which does not have a contiguous 2,000-mile border with the United States, does not have a history of laborers moving back and forth, has the same immigration quota as Mexico. The same legal immigration quota as Mexico. This doesn't make sense, all right? We have to recalibrate our immigration policies in some fashion. Now, to wrap this up, is America post-racial or well along the way to getting there? We've made progress on numerous fronts, including the election of the first African-American president. However, as I've indicated, Obama's election did not signal the transcendence or the end of race. Rather, his electoral success and even his time in office to this point are better understood as involving the deft management of the racial divide. Despite more ethnic heterogeneity in the black population itself, more mixed marriages, more explicit recognition of mixed race heritages and identity, there is little sign that a black racial category and identity is breaking down. Indeed, there's growing evidence of the power and persistence of hypodescent or of the one-drop rule. The black middle class, for all of its gains and achievements, is nowhere near being on a complete par with the white middle class, particularly in terms of access to and control over wealth resources. Indeed, this group lost ground over the last decade, especially as a result of the Great Recession. We surely do have an evolving and complex racial situation. No one can predict where the present circumstances will lead us 10, 25, 50 years down the road. It is worth reminding ourselves of two quick points. As I said a moment ago, at the beginning of the last century, our census recognized more racial diversity than it did circa 1970. As the institutions of Jim Crow crystallized, however, notions of a simple black-white divide were put in place. The point I want to make now, of course, is that history does not move in only one direction. We went from explicitly recognizing mixture, hybridity, the mestizo character of America, if you will, to completely obliterating acknowledgement of such diversity and distinctions. Let's not assume that that's impossible in the future. Brazil, for example, this is the second point, is a cautionary tale. The land of so-called at one point racial democracy has its enduring race problems, if you will. There's a strong pigmentation color hierarchy there, with those most readily classified as black suffering enormous educational and economic disadvantages. My point for the present for here is that complex categories need not result in the end of race and color bias, and need not result in the elimination of profound inequalities. I, for one, am very happy to embrace post-racial aspirations. My whole life and experience has been about that. And much has changed with regard to race in the U.S. that is salutary. The periods of great improvement, however, it seemed to me, involved deliberate progressive organizing and explicit pursuit of a more racially just social order. My message this evening is not one of cynicism and retreat and resignation, but rather of realism and clarity. The current post-racial narrative and the implication that all the important work on the racial divide is largely done, I believe to be seriously in error. Great challenges remain for any clear-eyed advocate of racial justice. I am always pleased and heartened, therefore, to conclude with Martin Luther King's favorite quote from theologian Paul Tillich. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Thank you all very much.